In this exercise, we'll leverage the power of the multipass approach by adding a number of color corrections and filters to enhance the composite image. By affecting different aspects of the car, we should be able to create a completely different overall result. So the key concept here is that these changes are being affected in real time and with no requirement to re-render from the CGI application. So you can see here that I've got the script open from the previous exercise, which is essentially a node tree comprising, should I say, of several merged render passes. So we asked the question earlier on, what's the point of actually doing this as opposed to using a beauty pass? And the point is that we can now access and perform separate operations on any one of these strands of the node tree. So we can use that to make some quite serious enhancements, or at least changes. I suppose enhancements is quite a subjective term. I'm just going to extend that down a little bit. We will struggle a little bit with the space within the screen capture software, but I just want to make a little bit of space in here. I'm going to start by making quite a radical change to the diffuse pass. So if we come in here to the diffuse, I'm going to actually change the color of the car completely. So I'll just come out and get hold of my viewer. And I'm just going to plug it into this node here, so we're looking just at the diffuse pass. Okay, so what I'm going to do in here now is I'm going to apply a U-shift effect. It's quite an interesting effect. Allows us to basically completely shift the tonality of this hue just by changing the rotation. And we have the full cycle, so you can see there that as I pull through, I can use the full cycle of the rotation of the hue rotation. So if I pull straight over here, for example, right over to the other side, then what I'm essentially doing is I'm rotating by a full 180 degrees. So essentially we are completely at the opposite end of the colour wheel to the deep reds with this kind of more pale cyan colour. We can also make a few more adjustments in here with things like the saturation and the brightness. For example, if I take the let's have a look. Let's bring the overall saturation down a little bit. Just round about here, and the brightness maybe again just down a little bit, somewhere around about here. So you can see how we've now darkened the image, but we're completely different in terms of the tonality. We're right at the other end of the color scale. So if we now flick our viewer back to the end of the tree, we've got a massive difference in our car. We can see that it's completely plausible again with regards to the reflections and the specularities, etc., being applied, but the car is a completely different colour just for the sake of a simple U-shift on the diffuse pass. So that was a nice easy one. Let's do something that's a little bit trickier. Let's get in on this on these reflections on the car. You can see that there's quite a lot of terracotta and red tonality in the background, and the reflection pass is meant to be reflecting the environment into the car, but we can see that the tonality of these buildings that's being reflected in here, it's a different tonality. It's much more sandy. Now let's say we want to actually try and recapture some of these more vibrant pinks and terracotta tones into these reflections. To do this, we're going to use a color correction node, and we're going to use a keying node called Keylight, and we're going to use those collectively to isolate these areas from the rest of the reflection pass and then perform a separate color correction operation. So I'm just going to come into this area here and make a little bit of space. So I actually need to just pull these out of the way a little bit because they are. Oops, I didn't want to disconnect that. I just want to make some space in this area where I can actually add these new nodes. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select this. I'm just going to type C to bring the color correct node. I'm just going to bring down the, maybe not the saturation. Yeah, I'm just going to bring the midtones down a little bit on the car, somewhere like that. Let's just review that just by turning it on and off. So I've just made the whole thing a little bit darker. So that's a better platform. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to apply a key light node. And I'm just going to plug this straight into this part. I don't need to attach this into the node tree, and we'll see why I don't need to do that in a second. But what I do need to do is I do need to sort of connect into the pipe at this point. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use this to pick and isolate these sandy tones from the image. So to do that, I'm just going to activate my screen color, and then I'm just going to come into this area. I'm just going to use the control key just to isolate that. I'm struggling to see that, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and get my viewer, and I'm just going to put my viewer straight into the back of the key light itself, so I can see a little bit better of what's going on. And I can see a lot clearer now that I've actually got those selections in that selection. I can just use Control and Alt and just move around it, and you can see that the more I move around, the more that area is being affected. So I don't want to get too radical on this. I just want to pick up some of the tones. So I can use Control, Shift and Alt and draw. That wasn't a very good example of it. The idea is just to draw a marquee which makes a slightly better selection for us. Okay, let's go with that. So I just did O to turn the overlays off. So that's got a fair range of these sandy coloured tones from the front of the image. So I'm going to add a second colour correct node now, and this next colour correct node that I'm going to apply is going to be just affecting these parts of the image. So I can click on that colour correct node and type C again just to bring a second colour correct node. It has moved my source, so I do need to actually put that source back on the first colour correct. And what I want to do now is I actually want to take the mask pipe out of this colour correct, and see that as I pull it out it says mask, and I just want to bung that straight into the key light tool. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm telling key light to basically use its selection as a mask, and then assign that to this colour correction. So when I start to make adjustments using this colour correction, we should start to see changes being applied straight into our image. So I'll probably need just to connect my viewer to this port so that we're actually looking a little bit further down the pipe. And we'll get up our colour correct to options, and we'll start to make a few changes and see what happens. So we'll just zoom out a little bit, and we'll get our master saturation slider, and we'll start to scrub it into the positive and negative values to see what happens. Okay, now that's quite interesting. If we look here, when I take the master saturation up, it seems to be working in exactly the opposite way to what we want. We can see that these sandy tones within the bumper area are completely unaffected by our change, but every other part of the image is affected. So this is kind of the opposite of what we want. Now that's easily solved. What we need to do is we need to come into the Ranges tab of our colour correct node, and we just need to set that to invert. So now if we go back to our colour correct and we start to make those changes, can we now see that that colour adjustment now is only being applied to the areas that were selected by key light? So you can see there that as I turn it up, it's only really these areas, maybe a little bit in the reflective areas of the wheel, maybe a tiny bit on here, I could obviously eliminate those by making more precise selections with key light. I can always go back retrospectively and do that, but for the sake of this we'll accept that. So what I'll do is I'll just set that back to its original, and we'll come into the colour picker, and what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to try and match the tonality of this to the background image. So I'm going to just come out here and disconnect my viewer and plug my viewer back into the root. Now I'm going to get the master saturation, and I'm going to see if I can match the tonality. So I know that I'm going to need to increase the reds and maybe add a little bit of yellow to that by reducing the blues, maybe a tiny little reduction on the greens as well, just to add a little bit of magenta into there, maybe a little bit more on the blues. Okay, and we can see that these tones now are starting to match up with the similar tones in the background. So let's say that I'm prepared to accept that then, so I'll close the colour picker and let's move on. So before we do, I'll just kind of move this viewer out of the way, back down into this area, and just try and tidy these up a little bit. So I'll just bring up the dot node just so I can kind of tidy those away a little bit. My objective here is just to kind of give myself a little bit of space so that I can bring the refraction, specular and ambient occlusion nodes back somewhere into the domain of the others. Okay, so let's move on. So the next layer that we've got is the refraction layer. Again, if we connect our viewer to the refraction layer and look at it in isolation, just to remind ourselves, these are the areas of light that are being reflected from other surfaces and being cast sort of indirectly. So we'll perform a couple of very simple operations just to reduce the impact of these refractions. You can see that they're quite radical. I want them to be a bit more diffuse and a bit sort of subtler. So I'm going to do a couple of things. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a blur node to the refraction. So I'll just type blur and add in a blur node. And we can see here that the blur node defaults to the Gaussian filter. I'm going to leave it at that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the size of the blur. And you can see, if you look at the headlight, you can see that as I raise that, you can see that it just starts to add a little bit of subtle blur into the actual refraction itself. So I've gone up there to a size of 4, which I think is a little bit too high. I'll just bring that back down. 3 looks better. So as a second operation, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix back the refraction pass, just so that it has less of an impact. So if I've just followed if I come into the blur, I could actually mix back the blur, but I don't want to do that. I want to actually mix the actual refraction pass itself back into the other layers. So I'm actually going to come into the merge layer for this particular pass, and you can see that I've got a mix operation on this, and you see that as I pull this down, you see that what happens is it starts to mix the pass back into the other images in the composite. So I'm just going to come down not too far, maybe about 0.75, and you can see that how much more subtle that particular effect is. So again, if I just turn on and off the diffuse now, it still has quite a bearing, but much less of a bearing. And I can do that. I can take that down a little bit more if I want to. Let's go for 0.5 or somewhere in that domain, and look at it now. You can see again commensurately having a more reduced impact on the overall composite. So let's move to the specular pass, If we just type D and toggle it on and off, we can see that this is kind of like a sort of illumination that's being cast over the surface of the car as a whole, and it's picking up slightly brighter in some of these hot spots across the car. And I'm going to perform a couple of fairly simple operations in here. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a glow just to sort of intensify the specularity a little bit. So I'm going to, with this layer selected, I'm just going to type glow and bring this up, and you can see that that has an effect straight away. If I just type D on and off to toddle it, you can see that that has a bearing straight away. And the reason why it has a bearing is because it has a brightness value of 1 already hard coded into the effect, so it affects the image immediately. And it's lightened it, and obviously if we want to lighten it more, then we could take that up more if we want. What I actually want to do is I actually want to get the specularity just to match a little bit in with the background. So I'm just going to take my colour swatch for the tint, and I'm just going to come across and pick an area from the image, maybe part of this back wall. I'll accept that. And if we just toddle the glow on and off now, you can see that that's much more subtle. If I want to reduce it a little bit more, again, I could mix down the effect, maybe to 0.9. Let's look at it now. And you see it's much more subtle, having a much more subtle cast. But again, the tint is actually much more relevant to this background. It's actually tying in a little bit more with this background. So that's the advantage of actually using the tint to actually mix the glow that's actually being applied onto the specular. So on to our final pass, which is the ambient occlusion. We've already looked at this, and we've already established that we can't toddle this on and off at the actual node itself. We actually have to toddle it on and off at the point of the merge. So there we can see the ambient occlusion, and we can see that it has quite a significant effect on this image. So what I want to do is I just want to reduce the impact that it's having, and again, a very simple way of doing that is just to bring up the merge node for this particular pass, and then just dial back the ambient occlusion, and you can see that as I'm sort of scrubbing that backwards and forwards, you can see that it's reducing the impact of the ambient occlusion. It's unusual to have a full 100% use of an ambient occlusion pass, so I'm just going to bring this down somewhere around about 0.6, and let's have a look at it now. When we look on off, it's a much more subtle effect, and it's much more naturalistic. So overall, we've had quite an impact, or we've made quite an impact on this particular image. It started off a maroon coloured car, and we've enhanced its specularity. We've controlled its reflectivity. We've actually controlled particular parts of the reflectivity so that we could actually colour tone these reflections that were in the front of the bumper. We've blurred and reduced the refraction effect. We've lowered the ambient occlusion, and we've tone matched the specularity to the environment. So overall, this hopefully has given you a little bit of an insight into how you can use the different passes of a CGI image to leverage the color correction tools within the compositing application to perform these enhancement effects in real time, and without ever having to go back to the CGI application. Really, the only reason that we should need to go back to the CGI application now is if we needed to make a significant change to the actual model itself, or to an animation that may be applied to it. So we can do a lot within the compositing application if the conditions are right for us to do it, and really the secret to that is in multipass compositing.